So yes, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening for this series. So this is a hybrid event. Welcome everyone online as well. So yeah, this event started as an idea at Tree Center for the Environment, Economy and Energy of the Brussels School of Governance last year. An idea developed with Simon Harpersberger about developing a series which will be 4 sessions looking at the interface between biodiversity and economic policies. And we aim to involve researchers which are looking at specific topics related to biodiversity and nature, but also from a governance, policy and economic perspective. So the Brussels School of Governance policy forums reflect on the new regulatory frameworks and initiatives that have been developed recently on how to better integrate, protect and restore biodiversity in economic policy making. So this event series is a collaboration between the VUB's Brussels School of Governance and Open Universiteit Netherlands, with a collaboration of distinguished experts who will join us for the sessions. It's also organized as part of the Jean Monnet Ecovalence chair. So this is a series of 4 sessions, which are taking place in a hybrid format. So they will be scheduled on a bi-weekly basis until end of May, so every 2 weeks on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., taking place physically at the Brussels School of Governance. So today's is the first session, so the introductory session on biodiversity beyond economic valuation, which will be moderated by Professor Jean Huget. And then, the 3 other sessions will follow. So one will be focused on May 2nd on trade, then the integration of biodiversity in trade, then a third one on May 16th on the integration of biodiversity in circular economy, and then finally one on May 30th on the integration of biodiversity in finance and investment frameworks. Just to preset that actually today's session will be recorded for the first part of the discussion, but then the discussions won't be recorded. On this, moving on, yes, let me briefly introduce David Leclerc, who's going to give us a presentation in a few minutes. So basically, he's a senior researcher at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, as part of the research program on biodiversity and natural resources. And David has a background in interdisciplinary systems modeling and an expert in that area. So now we'll pass it on to actually David to give us a short presentation as an introduction. So let you share your screen, David.
Very good. Can you all see my screen and hear me well?
Yes, we can, David.
Very good. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to present you some a shorter version of a presentation that was given at the Science Policy Forum at the CBD, and it was co-designed with Paul Ledley, who is working at Paris Saclay University. So it's fair to mention that he contributed to this presentation. So I will try to cover a few points that relates to my contribution in terms of scientific input to the design and the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And that some more narrative will take us from models and scenarios to the values question. And so I will start by reminding us of the challenge ahead. So to say, we are now in a set of frameworks, Global Biodiversity Framework, European Green Deal, and the Biodiversity Strategy, where there is this ambition of bending the curve of biodiversity loss. And what that means is that we are on a trajectory since several decades, where global biodiversity measures are going down, and this is expected to continue in the future. That would be a business as usual type of future, and this is in broad contradiction with what has been outlined as a 2050 vision by the head of states at the Convention of Biological Diversity. by which by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and widely used. And that is interpreted as global trends in biodiversity indices going up instead of going down. And of course, that's only one part of the future we want. And one way to broaden the picture a little bit would be to consider the Sustainable Development Goals, which gives a much broader set of objectives for global action. And of course, that makes it that we just can't restore biodiversity at the cost of other Sustainable Development Goals. And we actually have to align those and to understand how to align action towards this broader framework. And this is where the scientific community answer to that challenge with models and scenarios. So I'm going to talk you through the Bending the Curve initiative, which is one example of those, but there is really a much broader effort initiated by the IPBES, the kind of intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, the IPCC of biodiversity, so to say. And to promote models and scenarios as a way to understand how to deviate from a business as usual trajectory towards that better future. And so the idea of the Bending the Curve initiative, which was also strongly supported by WWF, was to combine the available data, models, and scenarios from land use and biodiversity modeling communities to address two specific questions that could be useful in developing the global biodiversity framework that has been recently adopted. Can we bend the curve of biodiversity loss without jeopardizing other sustainable development goals? And if yes, what can we robustly say about how to get there? And I will not spend too much detail on the modeling side of it, but that entails two major tasks. So designing new global scenarios that would be exploring the action space of what can we do to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, and then use multiple models to assess these scenarios quantitatively. So the scenarios themselves were trying to consider actions that could be useful towards the goal of bending the curve of biodiversity loss. So in particular, conservation action around more and better managed protection areas, and also increased restoration and landscape level planning. But these were also combined with other measures that are more tackling the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So this would be on the demand side, reducing waste, and also considering dietary shifts towards reduction in your consumption of animal products. And we would also consider supply side measures, in particularly increasing sustainably the yields of crops, and also considering sustainable increases in the trade of agricultural goods. And you could combine all of these interventions all together in what we would call the integrated action portfolio. And then we implemented that into models to project biodiversity indicators. So first land use trends that will be related to that at global scale, and then biodiversity indicators using biodiversity models. And what you can see here in this figure is probably the only modeling results I will show to you today. And it's basically depicting a business as usual trajectory in gray that is a prolongation of the historical trends in terms of biodiversity indices for various measures of biodiversity as they would be projected by different models. And you can see error bars as an attempt to understand what are the uncertainties associated with that. And you can see that within two different metrics related to the same biodiversity dimension, for example, the extent of suitable habitat on the upper left, you would see that two different models would project very different quantitative projections. So this was an attempt to address uncertainties associated with that type of modeling exercise. But the short answer is that the yellow scenario is actually allowing us to bend the curve, so to say, and to actually go upwards again before 2050. So it's an optimistic message, and the question that we weren't so interested in was, what can we say about how to get there? And it's clear that we cannot do without increased conservation efforts, and we need all of these three different pillars: more protected areas and better managed. We also need more restoration, and we also need more landscape level conservation planning. And that's the only way at which we can hope to bend the curve before the end of the century, so to say. And that's the only way to make sure that should we manage to somehow change the direction of biodiversity trends, it's really going to go upward again and not just flatten out. But we also show that this is far from enough, and that in particular, it's only by tackling the direct drivers of and the indirect drivers of habitat loss, in particular via dietary shift, reduced waste, sustainable increases in trade and crop yields, that we would be allowed, or we would be able to advance the bending before 2050, that would reduce significantly the losses in biodiversity that could occur between now and the time we bend the curve, so to say. And that's also, and importantly, the only way to keep the impacts of protection and conservation actions to prevent them from basically taking us away from the rest of the sustainable development agenda. That's the only way to keep food prices under control and to generate large synergies with GHG emission reductions for climate, with water use, with fertilizer application, which are also leading to biodiversity loss. And that will also create synergies with health. So what about values? So far, this was, I think, an influential study in shaping up the global biodiversity framework, and also other texts such as the EU biodiversity strategy on really highlighting that we need to address not just the usual interventions for bending the curve, so protection and restoration, but we also need to combine that with interventions on the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And once we have made the picture clear, it's transformative change, or it is now worded, that is really understood as a broad societal change that really goes all the way back to what our values are in terms of relationship to nature, for example. And this is typically what is in social and political science called the wicked problem. And we know one thing we know for sure about this is that we will not get away with discussing again and again what our values are about this framing of the problem and the potential interventions we could do. So in a sense, applying and implementing the EU Green Deal, the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and the Global Biodiversity Framework can only be achieved through deliberation that is related to values. And one example of that is, or that could be framed into modeling frameworks, would be, for example, equity considerations related to recognition. So typically, what is the extent to which the visions, the issues, and the interventions identified by the indigenous people and local communities or by developing nations, so typically actors that are not as powerful as others, all these issues are being framed into the modeling work and also into the political agreements that are being developed and their implementation. Another issue that is typically important and could be tackled via models is distributive justice. Are the distribution of efforts and impacts are these impacts and efforts fairly distributed across actors? And so there is the recognition that model and scenarios could actually be also mobilized to explore some of these issues. And what you can see on the right-hand side is just one example of how you could think a particular question, which is, how would you allocate efforts to different countries in terms of reaching a target of increasing the extent of natural ecosystem, as you would have it now in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And there is typically this idea that you could consider as an equitable distribution of efforts that some countries which have achieved a higher level of development and through that have also, so to say, converted a lot of natural ecosystems would be committed to higher level of efforts than would some countries which are still having a relatively low level of development and have maintained their impact on ecosystems relatively low. And so you could start to see a rationale for differentiating efforts across countries based on that type of considerations. And this is exactly the type of questions that were already source of tensions in the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework and will come again and again in the implementation. And that all comes back to relationship to nature and to different values. And that's typically something that has been recognized relatively fairly on by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES. And they actually have been trying to develop a new scenario framework that would take us quite far from what has been developed, let's say, by the climate community and really focus on the value discussions. And this is, I think, a very powerful tool to start to engage into equity questions that are key for implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and other policy frameworks that are geared towards ambitious action for biodiversity. So the take-home messages of my presentation is that bending the curve of biodiversity loss will require urgent, integrated, and transformative action, that the Global Biodiversity Framework and many other political agreements have actually several elements of that, and that if achieved, would initiate really bending the curve of biodiversity. So that's a positive message. And of course, these type of approaches have a lot to offer, in particular in relation to the model, or you can use model and scenarios to actually support the implementation of this type of global agreements. But it needs to be really further aligned and address issues related to social justice and values. And that's the only way that we can really, or that's one of the ways where, let's say, model and scenarios and scientists can really foster implementation of this biodiversity framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. So we'll keep the questions for after the discussion with our panelists. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. So yeah, my name is Jean Huget. So François already introduced me briefly. I'm an assistant professor at the Open University of the Netherlands, and I'm also affiliated to the biology department at the VUB here. So I will now invite the three panelists to come and sit here in front, and then I will briefly introduce them. Of course, David, you're also one of the panelists, so we hope you can hear us well. Give us a sign if there's some issue with the hybrid setting. So please, Ren, Stijn, and Luc, please take a seat. So building on your excellent introduction, I think we can now have a reflection coming from different sectors, different expertises. So I'll start there. I hope the camera can be turned a little bit so that we can see the panelists too. Thank you. So first on the left, we have Ren Spitsens, and she works for WWF Belgium as a senior biodiversity expert there. Then we have Stijn Neuteleers, who's from the Open University of the Netherlands and from Maastricht University. He's an environmental philosopher, assistant professor also there. And then we have Luc Janssens de Bisthoven, who's the head of the CBIOS program at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, and who works on the science policy interface when it comes to biodiversity. So I will first give all of you, let's say, about 5 minutes to give your first thoughts, first reactions. Not only on what David has said, but basically on this interaction between what plural valuation can mean for better biodiversity conservation and what this global policy architecture that we have now, the new GBF, what it can also mean for biodiversity conservation. So we know there's a problem, there's a biodiversity crisis. We know there's initiatives to tackle that crisis. One of these initiatives comes, I would say, from the academic and societal debate on plural valuation. The other initiative is a classic international governance architecture that is being set up and is also quite dynamic, the Global Biodiversity Framework. So yeah, what are your first thoughts on that based on your own expertise? I would say maybe Ren, we can start with you, if that's fine.
Yes.
Sure.
I think, yeah, coming from more the policy side, I think I have more to say about the policy framework than on the academic framework, but I'm happy to see that there are two academics in the panel to take on that side. I think as WWF, we were, of course, very much involved also when it comes to how the Global Biodiversity Framework during the negotiations. Definitely wanted as nature organization to have a say to it on the work. We now look at what came out of it. I think the first thing what we were very happy to see is that indeed after having the Paris Agreement for Climate, we now feel that biodiversity for the first time has a sort of Paris-like agreement with a very clear goal when it comes to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2050. And especially that reverse element is very important. Before this was always out of the discussion. So now we see this very clear global goal where we work towards. But we also, as WWF, see some challenges, especially when it comes to implementation and so on. There definitely some elements are there, but not everything we wanted to see there is in there. That's always the case, of course, when you work on such topics. But then it depends, of course, a lot on how this now is translated from the global framework, the global agreement towards the national contexts, because in the end you have a global vision, but it depends a lot how powerful this is and how effective this is, how this is implemented, of course, on the ground, meaning what now all the parties to the CBD, so all the countries in the global convention, how they will implement this. And the first step, of course, when I'm speaking about WWF Belgium, is what we do as WWF is following this very closely in Belgium, as my colleagues all over the world are following it in their countries. And that's a process that's starting right now. So for us, what's very important right now is that we see this translation going this translation goes in an ambitious way, in a fair way, as well. Belgium is a country where also when it comes to financial means, there are means available to work on biodiversity, but also work when we think about biodiversity elsewhere via, for example, ODA, we could do a fair contribution towards target. And I need to see, I think it's target 9 when it comes to the financial agreements in the GBF. So when I look at Belgium, I think for us, and not only for WWF, because we work together on this with multiple organizations here in Belgium, there are 3 big elements we want to see. And maybe I'm stating the obvious, especially after the presentation. It's really about protecting nature here in Belgium, but definitely also elsewhere. That's actually a bit the third part. So protecting nature here in Belgium, restoring nature here in Belgium. We see there is quite some potential, quite some studies were done both on the Flemish region and in the Walloon region. So we actually know quite well where the potential lies. It's rather a matter of now working on these elements. And the third one is actually this footprint, the Belgian footprint. And when I speak about footprint, the Belgian impact on biodiversity worldwide, when you think about imported deforestation, for example, is very high. With, for example, the harbor of Antwerp, there is a lot coming into Belgium, a lot transported from here. We're really a hub. So also to work on this impact and to decrease this impact, you have, of course, there the deforestation law that's now voted in the European Parliament and adopted. So also there, the next step is, of course, to implement this in a good way, making sure that what's agreed on European level, and also when I go back to the GBF, what's agreed on international level now triples down into the Belgian context, making the Belgian national plan, the Belgian national biodiversity plan, making this the strongest possible implementation with the points I already put forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Len. May I just also ask a little bit more about this distributive impact, because you spoke about fairness in particular, and you mentioned ODA, so official development assistance. I think that's the official term for everyone here. Yeah. So how does WWF, for example, act also on this or on the awareness surrounding that particular topic?
It's something where my colleagues are working more and more on, especially the colleagues working conservation rather than policy. But one of the elements or something that we analyzed quite recently, for example, in the context of this implementation of the GBF, is how we could work with ODA, looking at this budget, as we now see that biodiversity is currently covers 5% of the entire budget that Belgium is spending on development aid. This is, for example, something where we are looking into. This could be, especially in the light of the international agreements that Belgium signed on. This would be something to look into in a more deeper way, how Belgium could use and leverage their ODA in that sense, because there's a lot of win-wins. When it comes to development aid, we see this in multiple projects where you can work on conservation at one hand, but at the other end also work, especially when we talk about tropical forests, for example, when you talk about cacao farming and so on. There are a lot of good examples out there where not only WWF, but also other conservation organizations work at one hand to protect these areas and those natural forests, but at the other hand, work with the local communities to work on a sustainable cacao farming, for example. in that sense, giving the local communities that most of the times are very vulnerable, are in a very bad socioeconomic position, give them a sort of better and more stable income and way of living, but at the other end, make them stewards, or keep them as stewards really for the area where they're living and protecting this tropical forest from a complete clear cut, for example.
Okay, thank you. I will maybe jump to Luc now, maybe because of the ODA topic. And then I think you also gave very interesting hints, especially for Steen's contribution on justice. But maybe Luc, maybe you can first give your first ideas, and maybe if you feel like it gives some reaction to the focus on development aid and what that also means.
Yeah, so I am the coordinator of SABIOS program. That's a program at Science Policy Development Interface. And we are organizing capacity building in development countries on the topic of biodiversity around the policies of the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. And so I'm a practitioner, actually. And it's through my cooperation with Jean Huget that I do a bit academic work as well, bringing in my practitioner's expertise into his social methods to cope with ecosystem services of different socio-ecological systems. So my entry point here is that I first looked at the Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, which is replacing the previous strategy of 10 years of the CBD with the Aichi targets. And I first looked at the Aichi targets and looked at other ecosystem services actually mentioned in this in 2010 when it was done in Aichi in Japan. I found only 2 targets which were mentioning the ecosystem services. Meanwhile, 11, 12 years later, we have a huge explosion of scientific studies on the ecosystem services. So there is really, it's getting part of the methods, of the scientific method to look at ecosystem services. And in the GBF, I found, well, the GBF is actually divided into 4 goals, 4 main goals. The first goal is about the ecosystems, how to keep them, how to maintain them, to connect them, etc. The second is about management and use in a sustainable way. The third one is about the nature's contribution to people, which should be valued. So it is written in the goal C. It's about monetary and non-monetary benefits. So it's really it's black and white. And the fourth one is about implementation, finances, capacity building. So we recognize ourselves much better in this new GBF, especially because capacity building is now explicitly mentioned. Also because of my colleague Han, who is part of SABIOS and who was part of the Belgian negotiation in Montreal and in Kunming, who pushed through that you can only implement things if you train people. And as you saw in the graph of David Leclerc, you see all these blue points to the left. These are all the developing countries. So they have a low GDP, and they struggle to value their ecosystem services in the right way and to protect them because they have no means, not only no financial means but also no means of valuing them. So you need capacity building actually to increase the valuation of ecosystem services. That's very important. And in the GBF, there is one target 14, which is extremely, in my view, well written. I can just mention a few sentences. Ensure the full integration of biodiversity and its multiple values. So it's written multiple values or plural values. Maybe there are some semantics there. Into policies, regulations, planning, development processes, poverty eradication strategies. So they link everything together, the multiple values with the policies, the planning, the development. And that's really the right thing to do. So we are much more going now to a holistic approach, to And the holistic approach, you see that in every way. It's integrative. Think about agroecology, agroforestry. These are all integrative methods. And also in the valuation of ecosystem services, we don't only talk about ecosystem services as such, which are these four groups which you know: regulating, provisioning, cultural, and supporting. But now we add a layer which is resilience. And if you talk about resilience, don't keep in your narrative or in your frame into these different ecosystem services. You link them, and linking them is really part of the solution, I think, to get to resilient socio-ecological systems. And I think that's very important to add this resilience in the narrative. So that's maybe a last thing, if I may.
Go ahead.
It's just kind of metaphor, but if you look at a river, you can say you live from the river. So that's the typical anthropocentric view on the river or the landscape with a river. You live in a river landscape. It's still anthropocentric, but you feel already more part of it. You live with the river species and the habitats. It becomes biocentric or ecocentric, or you are part of the landscape, and now you become pluricentric. And that's exactly where we want to arrive.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Seems like a perfect connection also to Stijn's view, maybe more from, I don't know, philosophical and value theories perspective. So what's your take on this, Stijn?
Yes, so I can play the philosopher's role today. So I was not sure how to introduce, but I will say something first about economic valuation because it's in the title of the session, and I'll move gradually to plural valuation. That will not take hours, but I'll try to say so. I think many philosophers are very critical about economic valuation. It will not be hard to find very critical articles about that. But of course, as in many debates, the two extreme positions are not very plausible. That you say economic valuation should always be the case because else we have no impact, or that you say we should never have any economic valuation because that will corrupt nature, etc. So what we need to do is to think when we need what and why we need this type of valuation. So in some cases, it's clear that a more economic approach, so putting a monetary value on nature, can be of value. For instance, if you have to calculate compensation or for damage, for instance, or express what is the benefit of having tourism in a certain region if you want to compare it to previous mining activities. So to say also the tourism is beneficial for the community, etc. That are obvious ways that are where economic valuation can be used. Where it becomes more controversial is if it's used as a basis to compare different scenarios or different policy options. For instance, if we say we want industrial development or we want to have nature conservation, there you see, there it becomes more risky. And there we talk about, to which extent can we compare these types of values? I come back to that. Another way of using, which is complicated, I think, of using economic valuation is what it's very often the case, perhaps partly surprisingly, is to increase awareness. So say this nature is so valuable, we put a very high number of, and the idea behind that is that people become aware of the value of nature. I always struggle a bit with this. So the idea then is that this is motivational for people because, oh, I see this very high number, so it's very important. But of course, economic valuation is a hypothetical number. It doesn't raise this money in real world. It's comparable. It's as if there would be a market for nature, then it would have this value. I'm not very convinced that this is very motivational. If I say this job would earn you €100,000, but I will not pay it to you, then you mostly are not very motivated. Yeah, perhaps you are because you think, oh, this is a very important job, etc. And there is also, which is another argument in this debate, and there is also interesting empirical research about it, what we call a crowding risk, which means that if we talk too much about the economic value of nature, perhaps we start to think only in these terms about it. That's partly an empirical matter, but you feel that there is a risk. And what's the risk of this? Then nature becomes substitutable. For instance, if you only think in monetary terms, you can replace nature by something of comparable value. So yeah, so that's the debate on economic value, the fundamental philosophical criticism. You have also debates on discounting and how it relates to motivations, etc. But the fundamental criticism there is how can we compare different valuations of nature. So what economic valuation does is it looks at only one mode of valuing nature, namely it looks at what we call in economic theory, it looks at preferences, namely how important is nature for me expressed in a monetary value. But that's a very specific way of valuing something that's very important, but that's only one way. And so there has been a lot of criticism on this economic approach, together with an increasing awareness that we have to take account of local knowledge and indigenous knowledge. This has pushed for this debate on plural valuation, which was already existing for a long time in philosophy and in other disciplines, but now, especially with the IPBES, value assessment has come to the core of the debate. And so what's this debate on plural valuation? Well, nature has a lot of values, but what you also saw in the presentation of David, what we use now very often as a framework is this 3 types of values. It are 3 fundamental categories of valuing nature, but that doesn't only apply to nature, it also applies to persons, etc. So in philosophy, it's relatively common, but now it's also used to nature. So very briefly trying to introduce it. So we have, to a lot of goods, we have an instrumental attitude. So we think, what are the benefits for us? So this is expressed in economic valuation, but also in ecosystem services, as the word service says. So that's thinking about the benefits it has for us. A second way of valuing nature, which has always been present in the early days of the environmental movement, is the more intrinsic value. So you say, independent of values, even of benefits, even if it has no benefits for us, the blue whale swimming around very far from us, I value it intrinsically just because it is there. That's a very different type of value, and we also need very different tools to measure this. Mostly we do that in more ecological indicators, but that's more a proxy of intrinsic value. What would be a real expression of intrinsic value is rights for nature, which is also at the moment a big debate, which we, for instance, this rights for rivers, etc. Perhaps the most new in this debate is this idea of relational values, which sometimes is used as there's a third category, so that's the rest. But I think there is a clear basic idea in that, and what's very different from the other 2 categories is that I have a relation with a specific entity. For instance, the forest where I used to play as a child, I have developed a connectedness, and therefore that forest is important for me. Even if I move away and don't live and don't have any benefits for me, I have a kind of relational valuing of that forest. So it's not the ecological or the benefits that matters to me. It's also not it's not the ecological value. If it's replaced by a much biodiverse forest, I still feel hungry or whatever feeling that can raise. So it's a very different type of valuing. And so what the whole debate is, we need to be sensitive of these different types of valuing. And why do we need to do that? There's a democratic argument that we say, yeah, if you want to have policies that are based on what is important, then we have to take into account the different things people value in the different ways. But there's also an instrumental argument for this. If you don't take this into account, we will encounter protests, resistance, conflicts. And so I think that's also why this has now reached the highest policy levels, because if we want what we call a socially robust policy, we need to take into account these different ways of how people value that. I think that's more or less my story. We could now the interesting discussion that starts is, of course, how do we need to do that, which I think is now starting to be the topic of a field of research, because this relational issue, for instance, or the plural things are more difficult to measure. Nonetheless, if you have more participatory methods, more deliberative methods, automatically people will raise this type of values. That's inevitable, because people are connected in some way to this nature in a relational way as well. Yeah, that was my story so far.
Thank you, Stijn. Maybe I'll give the floor briefly again to Ren and then to Luc before moving to David. That's fine. Ren, do you want to react on that? And maybe in particular on this idea of putting a price on nature? How do you look at that? And how do you look at the risks and the benefits of doing that?
I think I'm very happy to sit here and to listen to Stijn now, and to also see how this is approached from his angle. I think when it's putting a price on nature, I see what you mean with the risks on it, and how this indeed sometimes is used in a way that gets you stuck in a kind of endless circle about discussing what the price should be. Especially when you were mentioning this discussion at our time, the discussion between like an industrial development project versus nature. There, immediately also had to think about what with the externalities, of course, of an economic value and an economic value, especially when you look at this industrial project. There is one thing how much this economically will bring, but what most often is left out is what, of course, the effect of this plot will be on the environment, and what, if we should value that, how then the balance would come out. And then also, again, of course, the question is how to value and in which sense, of course. Although at the other hand, I think, for example, what happened in the Netherlands with nitrogen debate gives a good example, or how of what the cost can be when you take out the externalities for a long time on certain economic activities. So I think this is one of the first things I was thinking about, together with the fact that when you look, being a biologist, when you look at nature and the value of nature, you also have this regulatory role, of course, of nature when it comes to the entire planetary ecosystem. It's very, very hard to put price on it, but it's very, very clear, and I think science is very clear about it. When you take this away, you can talk a lot about the economic value of everything, but then you come into a situation where everything you need to drive your economy, everything you need to drive actually a lot of parts of society will become very, very difficult, of course, when you completely degrade the climate or degrade the carbon nitrogen circles and so on. So there, also for us at WWF, that's a kind of something we always take into account, and a message that we try to bring forward as much as possible, that it's we depend as human beings a lot on nature and how the whole ecosystem is working together, meaning that you have, of course, all the living and non-living elements, but it's all interconnected. So you cannot take this interconnectedness out of the equation, and that's a very, very tough one to put a price on in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Luc, you want to react on that?
Well, yes, very interesting what you said, Stan. The valuation of nature can be also used as a weapon in global governance. For example, in the COP Eddie Congo did it. They almost stopped the CBD, the agreement, by saying, yeah, we don't agree with it because we as developing countries, we don't receive enough from the rich north to protect our nature, which is worth billions of dollars for climate change, climate mitigation. So it was used as a weapon. My first reaction there, because I was in Montreal also, I was very angry at Congo because I said, yes, but sorry, this country is very rich, but only takes the money for the happy few. So how do they dare to ask the North for more money? They have the money. But then on second thought, I thought, well, the fact that Congo did this step is an emancipation step in the decolonization process. And it has some positive elements as well. It's for the first time that a huge country like Congo, which is as big as Europe, raises its voice to say we are a biodiversity hotspot, do something for it, because we cannot manage alone. Even though they have to get up their, their corruption, they have to solve their own governance, I agree. On the other hand, it makes a lot of people think and reflect on it. So I think it was a kind of a disturbing element which could have positive impact in the long run.
It's indeed something that, yeah, I was not there in Montreal, it was my colleague Laurence Dres, you probably met there as well. But it's also really about this, when you speak about decolonization, it's something that also comes back to our work, where you see indeed this, I worked on climate before, where you now actually see sort of the same kind of tendencies from climate coming into the biodiversity debates. Also, looking at the global south, where most of the times indeed way more nature is present in a way better state most of the times than when you compare it to definitely Belgium or bigger parts of Europe. And then of course you get also this fairness and indeed this tendency, like we as global north who exploit our nature and most of the times, especially when you look at Europe, when you go back in time, when you see how much, for example, the forest was cut down over time and so on, and especially during the industrialization, then it's also this sort of like feeling I can imagine from the global south, like, okay, so you cut it down and used a lot of your nature for your economic development, and now you will come and say to us what we can do or cannot do because of the fact that you kind of destroyed most of the natural value in your own countries. So I can imagine that this indeed wasn't very tough at that point, because CBD COP is a very time-bound situation with an interesting reflection that also hopefully now continues after.
Yeah, and who are we to teach the South? We are still struggling ourselves even now, getting our act together. Look at the Josaphat Park in Schaerbeek. Look at the brown coal mining in Germany, where they even destroy villages for the brown coal, although we are now in a transition to renewable energies. Well, crazy, no? One of the richest countries in the world, Germany, with a green socialist government. So it's a world upside down. And so who are we to tell the Africans, stay out of your national park, don't use your resources? So it's a very difficult discussion, and we have to be honest in the way we discuss with each other. And what I want to add is that we need to use these social methods to increase the ownership of conservation. And that's maybe my dada. That means, and that's really at a very local level, when you talk with villagers around protected areas, you have to go away from this fortress conservation to a participative conservation. For me, it's the only way forward in the long term. If you continue with fortress conservation, sooner or later, there will be a clash of, can be even violent, like the Maasai destroying lodges in the Manyara region because they're not happy. So you need to talk with the local people, and there are several structuring methods to do that in workshops, but you also have to follow up what you do in these workshops, otherwise you get a kind of fatigue from the stakeholders. Again, a new funder coming there with new information, with how will we manage that park, and then they disappear and nothing changes. So it's a very intensive, time-intensive process, but increasing the local ownership of the scientists, of the authorities, of the communities, of the indigenous people is the key for good conservation in the long term.
Thank you, Luc and Ren. David, you want to react on some of these issues?
Thank you very much. A lot has been mentioned already. What I will try to do is maybe just formulate a few thoughts on what could be, let's say, on the one hand, modeling and let's say modeling in social and natural sciences applications of, or we could touch upon some of the issues that were mentioned. And so one of them was the question of understanding, now that the GPF has been adopted, monitoring very closely what is national action being undertaken and being designed right now. And I think one maybe complexity as compared to the climate example that we could draw parallels from, where we are in a more or less going in the same direction. I would think of national plans that are being ratcheted up in terms of ambition over time. I think there is quite a work or a contribution that science could do in try to compile what would be the outcomes coming out of national action plans and whether they do sum up at global scale to the level of ambition that is required to achieve the CBD target. And while for climate, let's say 1 ton of carbon less emitted in either Brazil or Europe counts in the same way. I mean, there are some nuances, but roughly comes in the same way to the global temperature target. This is far from the case in biodiversity. And I think there is a lot more complexity in understanding all local action summed up to global outcomes. And that's where models can be useful. And another one is the question of financial compensations and transfers. And I think there is to start to be an understanding of what are the costs of potentially protecting more and better managing protected areas, including in very different types of models where we would not do only forest preservation, but do something that is a lot more allowing in terms of human use of protected areas. And the same goes with restoration, and you can actually put numbers on this and really understand better what would be financing gaps across different places. And I think it's probably going to show the same picture that has been already shown for climate, that the commitments from the global north, to say, is still far below what is needed in terms of financial transfers. That would be fair. And I think that's another work where we can try to put some numbers in there. And now moving on to, let's say, the more critical self-reflection of what recognizing the priority of values and also the crucial role of capacity building in making these type of political agreements implemented in a good way. When it comes back to the role of model and scenarios, I think there are also a few key trends emerging, and one of them is that, for example, the more you integrate plurality of values, the more you come to realize that modeling that at global scale is actually fairly difficult, if not impossible, and even at local scale it's very challenging. But it at least makes the point clear that there is a lot more value in doing this type of modeling exercise at a much more localized scale. And there are really networks that are trying to do that also in a way that recognizes the need for decolonizing science in a sense, and that it's actually needs to be done by local scientific teams, and there is a lot of needs for so to say, capacity building in doing science and recognizing different ways of doing science as well in different places. And I think that's one challenge that we are confronted with. And but still somehow relates to the role of, or you could do model and scenarios a bit differently. And of course, perhaps there is also a need to recognize that model and scenarios has a very nice sweet spot and let's say capacity to reach out to policymakers these days, maybe more than some other actors and other forms of knowledge would have. And that there is also a need to share the space in how different forms of knowledge can influence policymaking. And I think this is all different fronts where IPBES is actually, I think, quite good in pushing the debate in the right place, or that lands in different political configurations in different countries can be very country-specific, very time-specific. And Brazil is another example where we had some wonderful collaborations with local Brazilian teams that were kind of, we were basically supporting them, but they were doing most of the work in trying to kind of come up with scientific products that would support the design of national commitments to the UNFCCC in terms of land use territories and carbon. And then the political landscape changed. And now it's turning the tide again, in a sense, in another direction. But we have to recognize that, yeah, there are also limits to what science can do, even when trying to do things in a, let's say, less colonized way.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Maybe Stijn, I'll give you the word again, maybe especially on these issues of fairness and ownership, which have come up a few times, but feel free to pick other topics, of course.
Yes. Yeah, I think what sometimes, fairness, etc., is a complicated issue, and what I want to say here is I think it plays the same with values. It plays very different roles on different levels. Global level, it's a very different issue than on the local level. Nonetheless, I think we often have, and this is typical for instance, for economic theory, that we think of fairness as something separate. So what we first do, what economists say, we first need to arrange efficiency, and then we have a good, we will have economic growth and generate a surplus, and then can we distribute this in a fair way? This is a very specific way of thinking about fairness in general. Environmental problems are problems of cooperation and collective action problems, and in such problems, fairness is inevitably involved, because you have to discuss who is going to do what and why, etc. And then if you say you will do everything and I will do nothing, you will not have cooperation. So fairness is almost, but on a big level, on a big scale, fairness ideas work very difficult. I think for me, but it's a bit personal, on the global level, it's a power issue. I think we are among political scientists here. They're more than normative issues. Power plays a big role, and we hope that the power balance falls in the right direction. On the local level, I think issues are very different, like you say. What we don't want, we want to involve local people because we need them to get these policies implemented. They're involved in it, and also there, if it's not fair, if it doesn't take into account how they see nature, how they value nature, then you take risks with your policies because you create your own resistance. And the same what values. So this plural values, I have to think about that. But what David said, I think indeed on the global level, for modeling, for instance, that's very complicated. It's very often about implementing conservation policies locally, and then we want to look at different valuations. What we are in general not very interested in is a kind of aggregate of relational value across the world. That could be an interesting exercise, but I don't know what that would mean. So in relational values, we could imagine that you have a nature reserve very locally or in Belgium, and you could express what are the benefits, what is the clean air that's provided, etc. That's the instrumental. You could also say the biodiversity, that's the more intrinsic. But you can also have stories about it used to be used in this way by the people, and now nature plays another important role for people, and they are connected in this way. And so I don't think there's one valuing better. We just value at the same time in different ways. But you feel that this type, for instance, what was the history of this place? That's difficult to say about nature on a global level. Perhaps something comes up there later, but yeah, just to make the main point, the global and at least the local, and there are many levels in between, are very different with regard to these issues.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll also focus on one question I was asking myself when listening to you all, is this plural valuation debate. Should we look at it as a new way of communicating about nature? So is it a new communication strategy, which is maybe more inclusive? Or should we focus more on the methodological aspects of it? Like it will bring us new insights. So I don't know, maybe I start with you then on this one. So communication or more insights, more methodology, or where would you think that the plural valuation debate brings the most added value?
Speaking from an NGO that really, like our base is really what the work is that, for example, scientists like here and probably at the other side of the table are doing. I think it goes both hand in hand, like without using this to also bring, like the first thing I think is, how to formulate this. Yeah, as I said, one goes with the other. You cannot use this as a communication tool and just as a hollow communication tool. For us, it's very important that, of course, this is further explored, and what comes out of the scientific work on the topic is something that we, as an environmental NGO, would really like to understand and take into account, and then also bring forward as indeed a mean to build some argumentation, because we see. And it's most of the time, not only I think WWF, that when it comes to bringing argumentation for nature, the arguments or most arguments that at this moment are used and maybe most of the times also touch ground with policymakers are mainly more this economic arguments or the ecosystem service arguments and so on. Well, I think that's bringing this broaden this way of valuing nature and how we look at nature, and also bring this into the discourse, can also open up another way of having discussions. When we think about what was mentioned by Luc before about Park Josaphat, it's indeed about more than only the economic value or lack of economic value of that specific area here in Brussels. It's also about what this currently is bringing to a lot of people living in Brussels, building a relation, indeed in a relation with this area, coming there to, for example, de-stress, read, have like, and this is also a way of looking at it that I think is not often enough already brought forward in discussions at this point. And I think an interesting angle that I also will take with me from this debate more, but very curious to also see when you go with this in an economic, not an economic, but in an academic way. What else is because I have the feeling that this field is not very much already explored yet, or am I mistaken?
Well, to respond on that, I think it's now really beginning. So it's more. So we have a kind of evolution from biodiversity to ecosystem services, and now what is called nature contributions to people, but there might be another term in the future. And this is now gradually more promoted by IPBES, and so I suppose it will trickle down. So yes. For some people, even ecosystem services are not well known, but you will see this. I suppose this is the next stage in the debate, but of course don't know about the future, but and so things are happening there, but the fact that there is already an IPBES assessment report on values suggests that there is a kind of it settles already on a scientific level, else it would not be part of the assessment.
IPBES, indeed. So in that sense, I think this, when developed more and what's now already done, serves as well in the communication, in advocacy and so on. But without the scientific work on it, then I think it will become very, very hollow in a certain way too.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Luc, maybe can you react on that? And I'm also wondering, based on your experience, especially in the Global South, in Africa, for example, we have lots of discussions with people, well, from local communities to policymakers to African scientists. Does this plural valuation debate create like more opportunities, like to connect, and maybe does it also create confusion sometimes in how to talk about nature among different stakeholders? I don't know how you see that. Is there a risk?
Well, if first there can be confusion in our own head, and there can be confusion in the head of our partners. These two confusions together create a bigger confusion. So it really depends. You have to be very clear in your messages and very clear in the dialogue with the partners. There are many ecosystem service tools, over 50, even hundreds. And these tools, they are meant to collect, to integrate, to synthesize, and to communicate about ecosystem services with the local people and with the authorities and the scientists. And this communication is almost in every tool as one step in the tools. And so it's essential, of course, like you said. Without communication, you can just keep your article in the shelf, so to say. So and in that sense, exact sciences need social sciences because communication is a social talent. It's also more developed with NGOs. I think the civil society knows better how to communicate. And I even would say the civil society is the voice of nature who has no voice, while economic developers they talk for themselves. We want to build apartments to earn money, so they talk for themselves. But who will talk for the insects and the birds who are there? Well, civil society with as basis science. So the IPBES and the policies, the national, European, and United Nations policies can support this.
Okay, thank you. David, you want to react on that? Because it reminds me of what you said on modeling and how models can bring these inputs of different types of knowledge together. What's your experience on that, like doing it in practice?
Well, to be honest, it's only starting for my own personal experience. And I think it's really following what was explained by Luc in particular on this idea that is slowly trickling down from IPBES recommendations, which is actually a long-term effort of more than a decade, I think, in pushing these debates through. And I think it's going not only through the channels of, let's say, IPBES creating a work program, and then this is being used by different funding agencies to design calls for scientific research, that is then translated into actual projects where I would be starting to be involved in. It's also recognized, I think, in the way decisions are being taken at different institutions. And so I think the CBD was also, for example, quite innovative in doing this local biodiversity outlook that started to combine what were the global biodiversity outlook, a lot more focused on modeling at global scale. So this is slowly changing the science to policy practice as well. But I think here my experience somehow is maybe more reflecting me crossing through these different points of different institutions and learning and being more and more interdisciplinary. But I think you would need probably a person well-versed and well knowledgeable about the evolution of the science to policy institutions to really come up with a statement of whether that's changing fast or not. But I think it's clear that you need both communication and practice, and they both go hand in hand.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm just taking a look at the time. Maybe I'll also give some space to the audience here in Brussels, but also online. So are there any questions or comments popping up from the audience at this stage?